The NFC East is the toughest division in the entirety of the NFL. The Philadelphia Eagles have one of the best rosters in recent NFL history and have just made it to the Super Bowl. The Dallas Cowboys seemingly win double-digit games every single season and always make it to the postseason. Washington always has a loaded roster, especially in the trenches, and has one of the most underrated weapon groups in the entire NFL. And then there's the New York Giants, who do it the Giant way and have just recently turned around their franchise from being one of the worst in the NFL in the past 5 or 6 years to being an actual competitor in the NFC, led by Daniel Jones and Saquon Barkley. The biggest reason why the Giants have changed the direction of their franchise for the good over this past season is due to Brian Daboll. But we also have to appreciate Joe Schoen for a second, because without Joe Schoen, the new general manager, there then wouldn't be Brian Daboll, the reigning NFL Coach of the Year and the man who got the most out of the New York Giants roster last season to lead them to a successful season in a season where everyone doubted them. Daniel Jones is still a young ascending quarterback, whether you like it or not. He was already a top half quarterback this past season in the NFL, and I believe he's going to play his way into becoming a top 10 quarterback in the NFL this season. He's smart, tough, and dependable, big, strong, and athletic, one of the best rushing quarterbacks in the NFL, as well as one of the most accurate quarterbacks behind the line of scrimmage, and he throws a fantastic deep ball, although this past season the Giants didn't have to use it much given the lack of personnel surrounding him. And while DJ has been on the up and up, he also cleaned up the biggest flaw in his game, the turnovers. Not really a turnover machine anymore like he used to be. This guy is just a solid quarterback, and I can't wait to see what he's going to do with the new pieces around him in this upcoming season. The Giants acquired tight end Darren Waller from the Las Vegas Raiders. He will probably be the Giants' #1 receiving weapon on offense, regardless of the tight end label, similar to a Travis Kelce in Kansas City, which the offensive coordinator Mike Kafka is quite familiar with, coming from that Kansas City system. While Darren Waller was the highest profile player added to the New York Giants roster in this offseason, they added plenty of useful young players from the draft. Center John Michael Schmitz, lockdown pressman corner Deonte Banks from Maryland, and the speedster who can also run routes as well, Jalen Hyatt from Tennessee. And then the rest of the guys drafted by the Giants were mostly just late round flyer depth pieces, but Eric Gray in the 5th round is the most notable, as running back depth was a position of need for the Giants. And the last of the players signed that I think could actually make an impact right away for the Giants will be the fast athletic receiver Paris Campbell, linebacker Bobby Ukiriki signed in free agency from the Colts, as well as a pair of depth piece D tackles to add to the defensive rotation to accompany Dexter Lawrence and Leonard Williams. The New York Giants have done everything right so far, but unfortunately, I don't think it's going to be enough for them to win this division. I have them winning 10, maybe 11 games if everything falls perfectly. There's still a lot of ifs, there's still a lot of moving parts, and there's still a lot of unknown variables. They're a team that needs maybe one more year before they push all the chips into the center of the table and go from competitors to contenders in the NFC. I believe the Philadelphia Eagles are going to be the first back-to-back winners in the NFC East since they previously did it in 2003-2004, about 20 years ago. And it should be no shocker that Philly is clearly the favorite to win this division, for good reason. You would think in the offseason Philly took a beating by the losses in free agency, but they really didn't. Losing Hargrave was a big hit, but he's way too expensive, and they drafted 2 first-round picks from Georgia, Jalen Carter and Nolan Smith, to fill that void on the defensive edge. And then as far as running backs go, they signed DeAndre Swift, as Miles Sanders signed with Carolina, and they lost TJ Edwards and CJ Gardner-Johnson, but at least they kept Slay and Bradbury, and even Jason Kelce is going to stick around for one more year to solidify that offensive line. Jalen Hurts is still one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, let alone the best quarterback in the division. They still have Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown, and they still have a lot of the surrounding pieces and household names that made this team Super Bowl contenders in the previous season. The only thing that concerns me about the Philadelphia Eagles for this upcoming season is they lost their offensive and defensive coordinators. I just think that's a bad thing, especially if you were already in a winning situation. I mean, they made it to the Super Bowl. At that point, you'd rather just keep the band together and, try to run it back. And now they have hired Sean Desai from the Seattle Seahawks, as well as promoting Brian Johnson from within the organization. This could just be a minor point in the offseason here for Philadelphia, but I'm just wondering how much will they change the scheme in the system? Will they make Jalen Hurts and the offensive components around him change their ways, or will they just accommodate the skill sets presented to them? But regardless of how this specific situation in Philly plays out, they're still going to win this division. They're still going to win 12, probably 13 games. I'll just pencil them in here at about 13-4, winning the NFC East for the 2nd year in a row. Historically, Dak Prescott's been pretty damn good for the Dallas Cowboys. but evidently that was not the case last season, where he only played 12 games due to fracturing one of his thumbs and one of his hands, but still leading the league in interceptions thrown with 15. I do think we have seen Dak Prescott's ceiling, but that ceiling is not what we saw last year. If he can return to form, I actually do think Dallas has a chance to win with him if he's surrounded by the right pieces, which he seemingly always is. Even after cutting ties with Zeke Elliott, Dak still has enough weapons for a quarterback of his expectations given the numbers he's put up in the past. Their weapon group isn't elite, but it's very good. And if Dak is really as good as he is or can be, he should have no issues with what he's presented with. CeeDee Lamb is a pure alpha wide receiver, clearly a wide receiver 1, probably a top 10, maybe top 15 at the absolute worst wide receiver in the NFL. He's a stud. And now without having to worry about feeding Zeke or whatever, they can actually give the ball to the better damn running back, Tony Pollard. This guy's an absolute monster with the ball in his hands, wildly efficient at all stages of the game, and can seemingly do it all. I think Dallas was getting ready to cut ties with Zeke for at least a year now, given they kind of already had depth guys on the roster, as well as drafting one late in the draft this past season, as well as signing Ronald Jones in free agency. Losing Dalton Schultz does kind of sting, but at least they have Michael Gallup and Brandon Cooks, the veteran wide receiver journeyman who's honestly pretty good and pretty underrated. All these weapons and Dak Prescott himself should be enough for this offense to fire on all cylinders. This Dallas defense is elite. Micah Parsons is one of the best defensive players in the entire NFL. DeMarcus Lawrence is still excellent, and Trayvon Diggs, the ball hawk in the secondary, is always something for the opposing quarterbacks to have to worry about, while playing opposite now to Stephon Gilmore, who they acquired in free agency, and all while the offense is behind a top 10 offensive line seemingly every season. Dallas did move on from Kellen Moore in the offseason though, and they still have Mike McCarthy as their head coach. Honestly, I really don't have any opinion on Dallas's coaching staff. It seems fine to me, and they also hired Brian Schottenheimer from within the organization. Dallas fans, if you're watching this video, let me know what you think of the coaching staff. I've been going back and forth, honestly, about assessing the Dallas Cowboys. I think they're in that 11 to 12 win range, 12 and 5 like they usually do, but I'm going to put them down here as 11. I think 11 and 6 is more reasonable. There's also a lot of uncertainty in Dallas, but I think they're just way too stable of a roster, and I do think they will finish second in the NFC East. Eric Bieniemy lands another offensive coordinator job here in Washington, and it's probably one of the better roster moves that Washington has made in totality this offseason. Eric Bieniemy, former offensive coordinator of the Kansas City Chiefs, now gets to take his hand at grooming the development of Sam Howell, the young, now second-year quarterback out of UNC, who the Washington Commanders are deciding to roll with for the 2023 season. Luckily for Howell, there's actually some good talent around him in Washington on the offensive side of the ball, particularly in the weapon groups. As far as running backs go, Antonio Gibson is very versatile, great in the run game, excellent in the receiving game, and overall just a good tool to have on offense. And then you have Brian Robinson, the real grinder, dirty runner type of running back, not too relevant in the pass catching game, but you can definitely hand the ball off to him 10 plus times a game to get some production out of him. Young quarterbacks love having good running backs, and Washington has two for Sam Howell to work with. Regardless of being plagued by bad quarterback play throughout the entirety of his young NFL career so far, Terry McLaurin is the premier wide receiver 1 in Washington and one of the most underrated and best wide receivers in the entire NFL in my opinion. McLaurin will be Sam Howell's number 1 target this season in the NFL, and if you're Sam Howell, you have to love that. Curtis Samuel is another piece accompanying Sam Howell in this Washington offense. He's a nifty toolbox receiver who has a very versatile skill set. And Jahan Dotson is just a more prototypical wide receiver, but he's an electric young player, awesome in the red zone. I really like him moving forward as a piece on this offense in Washington. Washington's defense, particularly up front, is one of the better defensive fronts in the NFL. They're always good in the trenches, especially with Jonathan Allen and Darren Payne up front, arguably 2 top 10 D tackles in the NFL. And then you got Montez Sweat and Chase Young on the perimeter, who's a capable edge rusher when healthy, but so far not living up to that number 2 overall pick selection when he was drafted. But overall, this defense is good. They hold their opponents to a low points per game, which is my favorite stat for defenses, and they also supplemented the defense and some of the offensive line as well in this draft. Particularly in the secondary was the weaker side of that defense, so then they get a first-round corner, a safety, and then addressing some of the offensive line later on in the draft because that is also a position of need in Washington. This is a team where you could tell me they would win 5 games or they would win 9, and I kind of have to respect your answer either way. I feel like there's a lot of volatility here for Washington. I'm just going to put them down at 7 wins. So where does that leave us? I think Washington is going to be in a very similar situation this coming season as they were last season. They're going to be a pretty good, pretty solid roster, and I think they're going to just fall a little short, not make the postseason, because I think they're going to be held down ultimately by quarterback play again, unless Sam Howell is good. He's an unknown variable here in this equation. If he ends up being better than expected, this team can be an over 500 team, maybe even make an NFC wildcard appearance, and I just think that's one of the less likely outcomes, especially while being in one of the toughest divisions in the NFL, the NFC East.